these things here are out of our control. What the Fed does is out of our control. And yet, and this is the big picture up here. The only thing that's important is when you sit down with us, that you identify what it is that you want, and then we identify what X is, how much money you need for it, and then how we're going to get from here to there. That's what's important in this.
Welcome to One With the Other Way, a podcast about your journey and finances. I'm your host, James. We have Wanda and Peggy with us today. Our topic for discussion is actually the Fed and the Fed meetings. It's kind of actually a good week to do this because the week we are filming this is actually the week the Fed is actually meeting. So this is very fitting. Now, Wanda, would you be willing to kind of discuss what the Fed is and how often they meet, especially since they are meeting this week?
Right. The Fed is the place that determines monetary policy. They are meeting this week. They have 8 meetings a year for a framework, right? And there's what they call a blackout period before the Fed meets. And it's 2 Saturdays before the Fed meets. And that blackout lasts until the meeting is over, the midnight the next day. And so you'll notice that there's always a flurry of speakers before that Saturday. I think the Fed chairman himself spoke the Friday before, and then they're not allowed to speak for a whole week. So everybody tries to get in their last little bit before the meeting, and then the rest of us speculate as to what we think is going to happen, which I think causes more chaos because we're guessing what they're going to do. One of the key things they do is determine the overnight lending rate and decide whether or not they're going to raise the rate or lower the rate.
Now, Peggy, kind of go more into the Fed meetings themselves, the noise around them, and maybe, Wanda had mentioned the overnight lending rate,
Right.
what they're kind of doing with that.
Well, so basically the Fed is having a meeting and you hear lots of discussion about it. And like Wanda said, they come out and they talk the different members, and then they have that blackout period where everybody's now speculating and anticipating what they're going to do, which of course, when that happens, people react and you might see some volatility in the market. But then when the Fed actually meets, they're discussing the economy. Is it in expansion? Is it in contraction? They talk about inflation. They talk about the money supply and interest rates. And they discuss all of these, in detail more than I'm definitely not going to go into, and more than any of us probably need to be aware of on a general basis. And then they make a decision of what they're going to do. Are they going to decrease the money supply? Are they going to raise or lower interest rates? And then they make an announcement.
And then following the meeting, the noise following it, what do we see usually happen there?
Well, it depends on a lot of things about what everybody predicted, right? So you get volatility and reactions about what just happened. And are we expecting the interest rate to go up? Well, the market will price it in, expectation, right? So then when the Fed does something that is not necessarily expected for whatever reason, because they have more information and they had their meeting and they made a decision, then you might see more volatility and people changing direction.
First of all, I do need to clarify what the FOMC is the Federal Open Market Committee. It is a group within the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve has 12 banks. All 12 banks have a president of each bank, and the Federal Open Market Committee will be the 12 presidents plus the governors. Maybe clarify that, Wanda, quickly.
So right. So you mentioned the regional banks. We have a Fed president, and 7 out of the 11 members are what they call voting members. Others can comment, and then the others are in through rotation. So one of the key things that the FOMC does, as Peggy mentioned, is they raise the rate or they lower the rate. And so if they are raising the rate, they're trying to tamp down inflation and help with savings. A rising rate environment means that they're more concerned about inflation. If they are lowering the rate, then they are more worried about the economy in terms of, is the economy expanding appropriately given the conditions? And so they can either be that bullish side where they're raising the rates. And if they're raising the rates, that generally causes business costs to go up. It encourages people to save. And then on a practical level, like where you and I are concerned, instead of buying maybe the $300,000 house because our rates are higher, we might buy a smaller house, right? You can see how that would slow the economy if I'm buying a smaller house. Or I might delay the purchase of a house, again, slowing the economy. As I mentioned, there's that blackout period, and we spend 10 days speculating, but we spend every day speculating. We all do. We look at our interest rates in our houses and we say, can I get a lower rate or can I get a higher rate? And the Fed influences the rate that the banks charge us for our homes. If they're raising the rates, the mortgage rates will go up. And it's anticipatory. So not only do we talk about it the week before, we also spend a year talking about it. No one decides to buy a house tomorrow. They're saying, oh, I think I'm going to buy a house next year. What do we think the interest rates are going to do? And the market and the banks respond accordingly. So like right now we're talking, hey, what's going to happen in 2025? Are they going to raise the rate? Are they going to lower the rate? And then we try to guess based on economic conditions what we think the Fed's going to do. Are they more worried about inflation or expanding the economy? And if we think they're more worried about inflation, we think that they'll raise the rates. And then the market starts to, what they do, price in. The market starts to say, well, the Fed's probably going to raise the rates. It's going to be more expensive for companies to make money. And so earnings are going to go down, and that tends to drive the market down in anticipation. So you're anticipating both, right? How much my home is going to cost as rates rise, and also what's my portfolio going to do? So what's my net worth going to do in response to that? Because that was where you and I reside, right? What's my mortgage rate, my major purchase, and what's the value of my retirement accounts? And if they're raising the rates, right, my retirement accounts potentially will go down because earnings are going to go down for companies.
Thank you for kind of going a little more deeper into how we see responses to the FOMC. So let's kind of quickly go into what they are talking about and how they are actually making changes. We talked about how they might influence interest rates. We talked about the money supply a little bit with Peggy, but let's kind of go a little deeper for a second. So the Fed influences the federal funds rate, also known as the overnight lending rate, by the interest it pays on banks for their reserve balances. And so if you think about it, banks are making loans overnight. And so the interest rate that the Fed is choosing in a way for the federal funds rate may not be the interest rate you see on your mortgage, but it will influence the interest rate you will see on your mortgage. So that's kind of what the influencing process looks like. But the other things they do is they control the money supply. And so you think about the amount of dollars in the market currently, the US dollar, how many dollars are out there. Well, how does the Fed influence how much dollars, once they're out there, can they get them back? Can they just take them from people? That doesn't happen that way. The government sells securities, treasury bills, for example. And so the Fed will say, okay, well, if we want to add more money to circulation or take money out of circulation, they will buy or sell bonds to basically change the money supply. So that's an example of how they can affect these things. If there's more money in the economy, that means that the value of the dollar is less because there's more dollars out there. If there's less dollars out there, that means the value of the dollar is higher. And so inflation would be, if there's more dollars out there, there's likelihood of more inflation of the dollar. So they can control that in that way as well.
The only reason that's important to us, right, is monetary policy helps lower or raise inflation. And primarily with the monetary policy, the Fed's key tool is raising the rate. The cost of borrowing from the banks causes us to be inclined to save and not spend our money. And putting more money into the economy and buying treasury bills is inflationary because there's more money. That means things are more expensive for us.
But I just wanted to kind of highlight what they do. And then they have these two different types of policies of trying to control the economy through expansionary, which would be the lowering interest rates, buying government securities back to increase the money supply. And that's to encourage borrowing and spending, versus contractionary. That would be higher interest rates, government sell securities, and that would discourage borrowing. So those are the kind of ways that they influence the economy in the overall sense. Now let's kind of go quickly then into the relevance of all these things, because this is all, high up here, hoity-toity, ivory tower economics style. How much does this actually impact your average everyday person?
Okay, so my thought is our families don't need to necessarily be worried about everything that the Fed is saying. We are monitoring that as part of what we do in looking at how we should invest your money in the years to come. You can always ask us questions. I would encourage you asking questions as you read and see things. Yet, as I mentioned previously, there's two places. Your mortgage rate, the biggest purchase you ever make, is affected by the interest that you're charged by the bank, and that is influenced by the Fed. And then the other thing is inflation, how much things cost, affected by whether or not they're raising rates or lowering rates. Raising rates causes a tamping down of inflation. We worry about inflation, but really the only thing is, do I have the money to buy whatever it is? If whatever it is costs X, do I have X? And that's the important thing. And then in a slowing economy, you might be worried about your job and your personal employment. And that's how this affects you. If the economy slows, right, then potentially you could lose a job. Yet those are things that you're talking to your financial advisor about, what's going on in your life. These things here are out of our control. What the Fed does is out of our control. And yet, and this is the big picture up here. The only thing that's important is when you sit down with us, that you identify what it is that you want, and then we identify what X is, how much money you need for it, and then how we're going to get from here to there. That's what's important in this.
Now, Peggy, you mind going a little bit into, we talked about this in a previous podcast, ART, amount, rate of return, time. Where do we see that kind of fall into this?
Well, I mean, obviously, like Wanda said, that we look at all of these things and we're planning in as much of it as possible because, like she said, we don't have control of what the Fed does. The market reacts and it's very reactionary and it'll have volatility. And yes, your interest rates may go up. And then how does that affect you? I think that, having your plan and sticking to it and discussing all these things with your financial advisor is the best course, and not to get caught up in all of the noise and the things that happen in the short period of time, because we're looking at long period in most cases for your financial picture.
It's interesting you said ART, right? It's true. And we are looking at long picture. And yet here we are talking about the Fed in the next 8 meetings, or, the meetings that we'll have this year. And as you mentioned, Peggy, it is a long haul. You will live longer than a year. So as taking a look at the art of your financial plan to make sure that it's doing the thing that you want it to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for listening to today's podcast on the Fed. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, you can email us at office@financesforreallife.com. We'd be happy to schedule some time as well. You can find us at financesforreallife.com. Schedule an appointment on the top right of the page. And we post every 2 weeks, so we look forward to having you in the next episode.
Securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA, SIPC. Investment advice offered through Finances for Real Life, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision.